We're going to continue our discussion now about infectious causes of cancer by focusing on Helicobacter pylori. It's a particular bacteria that can cause infection of the stomach, ultimately leading to both development of peptic ulcers and also gastric cancer. Okay. So again, this was really important scientific work that showed the connection between infection with this bacteria and it directly causing and leading to both peptic ulcers and then ultimately down the line putting you at higher risk for gastric cancer. It was so important that it was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2005. This prize was shared by Dr. Marshall and Dr. Warren. And there's a pretty famous anecdote where Dr. Marshall was working on this. He was so convinced that there was this connection between H. pylori infection and ulcers that he was so frustrated with the fact that it wasn't showing this in animal models that he decided to drink a cocktail of H. pylori, ultimately giving himself the infection, and then he had developed gastritis, he developed ulcers, and then he was able to culture that bacteria from his own ulcers. Again, not recommended way to conduct any sort of scientific experiment. But in the end, he did win the Nobel Prize, and so it's sort of a famous story, and it's actually included in your book. Okay, so what is H. pylori? So Helicobacter pylori, it's a spiral-shaped gram-negative bacteria. You can see that on the left in this micrograph. It has this characteristic spiral shape. And what's pretty remarkable is that it's able to live and thrive in the very harsh environment of the stomach. One way that it's able to do that is that it possesses this specific enzyme called urease, which is able to convert urea into ammonia. So this is going to function to actually raise the pH of the stomach environment, which is going to make it more optimal for the bacteria to grow and divide. Because again, remember, your stomach's where you're digesting all this food, breaking down compounds. It's at a very, very low pH where all of these enzymes sort of function. And so that's not going to be ideal conditions for anything to grow and divide. And so the way that this bacteria can cope with it is to actually produce ammonia as a byproduct of a specific reaction and raise that pH to make it a little bit nicer to live in. Okay. And so what does H. pylori infection look like? And most individuals that have H. pylori present in their stomach, they're actually asymptomatic. So they have no signs knowing that this bacteria is there or present, and it's really not causing them any problems. And about 10 to 15% of the time, though, the presence of this bacteria can lead to inflammation. It can lead to a state called gastritis, where you have inflammation in the stomach lining. This can also then lead to the development of ulcers. So the first place that you get ulcers, and it's the most common site of ulcers, is going to be in the duodenum. So this is sort of that exit from the stomach. And so because there's all this stomach acid present there, it's a highly acidic environment, and you're at much higher risk of developing stomach ulcers there. When you have H. pylori present, you have this gastritis state, there's a lot of inflammation, you're then much higher risk of developing ulcers there. The other place is that you can get gastric ulcers, so ulcers present in the stomach. And so in some individuals that have H. pylori infection, you'll see actual stomach ulcers. And again, these are much less common than those duodenal ulcers that you would see arising in the duodenum. In some individuals, this over time, having this gastritis present, having these ulcers develop, it puts you at a much higher risk for developing stomach cancer or gastric cancer. And so having this H. pylori infection, having this inflammation state, this gastritis develop, it puts you about a 2 to 6-fold increased risk of developing gastric cancer, or another cancer called mucosal associated lymphoid type lymphoma. And so this is if you compare those that have H. pylori present in the stomach with those that do not have H. pylori present. Okay. Gastric cancer overall is the fourth most common type of cancer and the second highest cause of cancer-related death worldwide. And we'll look at some of the distribution of where do you see gastric cancer incidence worldwide, and you can see that it's very prevalent in other countries because it's really dramatically declined in Western populations during the 20th century. So you're seeing gastric cancer rates go down in certain countries, whereas it's remained very high in certain regions, such as Eastern Asia, Eastern Europe, and some parts of Central and South America. And I think you can see that when you look at gastric cancer prevalence sort of worldwide. You can see that it's extremely high in places like Russia, portions of South America, as well as certain regions in both Asia and Europe, whereas it's not too high in certain other regions like Africa or other parts of Asia. And so this also correlates with where you see gastric cancer mortality rates. So again, they're much higher in regions where you see gastric cancer increased, and like I said before, it's going to be the second leading cause of cancer deaths worldwide. So how are you able to, if you know that there's this connection between H. pylori infection and then this causes both ulcers as well as cancer, are you able to then screen and test for H. pylori? And so, yes, this is true. There's a number of different tests out there that can confirm the presence of H. pylori in the gut. These are usually, the most common one is actually a non-invasive breath test. So you go into the doctor's office, you breathe into this balloon, and they're able to test whether or not you have H. pylori present. You can also do serological testing, as well as if you had ulcers present, they were doing endoscopy, what they could do is take a biopsy and actually test for the bacteria then. And so once you get this result that yes, you are positive for H. pylori, can you then treat it? Can you get rid of this bacteria and then lower your risk for developing ulcers, as well as ultimately lowering your risk for cancer? And that's true as well. Because it's a bacteria, you're able to treat for H. pylori with 2 weeks of antibiotics. So taking a particular type of antibiotic that's going to be effective against gram-negative bacteria. So two that are usually recommended are tetracycline or amoxicillin, and you're going to be able to combat that, combat both the bacterial infection by treating it with the antibiotics, and that's usually also given in conjunction with a proton pump inhibitor. And so because you had this bacterial infection, and then that bacterial infection caused this inflammation, you really want to treat both at the same time. So you're taking the antibiotics as well as you're taking this proton pump inhibitor. I have here, you can see Prilosec. It's now available over the counter. It's a really common one. That's going to help give your stomach the chance to heal. Because again, remember, H. pylori, this bacteria, is causing this inflammation in the stomach. We've talked before in other lectures that inflammation can then lead to cancer, putting you at higher risk. So you really want to treat both. You want to get rid of the bacteria that's the underlying cause of the inflammation, and then treat the inflammation as well. Okay. And so this kind of leads you to the question that, you know, if there's this connection between H. pylori and this connection between ulcers and higher risk of gastric cancer, wouldn't it be best if we could just maybe eradicate H. pylori infection? So if you were able to remove H. pylori from a population, people no longer have it present in the stomach, would that then kind of cure gastric cancer? Would you see gastric cancer go away? And this is sort of supported by long-term data. So they did a study before, which is a randomized clinical trial in China. Again, remember, China is a place where there's much higher rates of gastric cancer, as well as higher rates of H. pylori infection. And so they found that short-term treatment with antibiotics, so getting rid of H. pylori in this population, it really reduced the incidence of gastric cancer. And so when they took this out for a 15-year period, they saw that gastric cancer incidence was reduced by almost 40%. So here you have a study where they're actually going in, they're randomizing the treatment in the population with antibiotics, and they see that getting rid of H. pylori leads to this pretty dramatic reduction in gastric cancer in the population, to about 40% reduction. And so you can see, you know, at least what this study suggests is that yes, this could potentially be a way that you could go in, treat a population, and kind of lower overall risk of gastric cancer. But there's some caveats to this. It might seem intuitive, you know, and you have these studies that show that gastric cancer goes down, but really remember that only in about 10 to 15% of individuals infected with H. pylori actually develop ulcers, and then the percent that actually develop gastric cancer is much lower than that. And so it's really only a small amount of the population that would get this added benefit. Massive eradication or massive administration of antibiotics has its own problems. If you were to go in and, you know, treat everyone in the population with antibiotics that would, would get rid of H. pylori, it could lead to, increased antibiotic resistance. You could then be selecting for antibiotic resistant strains of H. pylori, which would be an even bigger problem if now you have H. pylori that no longer responds to treatment in a population. And again, it's going to be sort of is this the best use of our resources? Is this a way that you want to use antibiotics that we have to kind of, treat a problem that isn't really there, or, maybe prevent a small portion of the population from developing something from this infection. And then you also have to keep in mind that what we know now is that our guts are these, hosts to these rich diversity of all different types of bacteria, that a lot of them are quite helpful for us and help maintain sort of this healthy microbiome ecosystem in our bodies. And so going and just trying to get rid of one specific strain of bacteria that you think is bad is going to also get rid of lots of good bacteria. And we don't really know what the consequences of this sort of antibiotic, this sort of mass antibiotic treatment could be. And so I think that, the jury's still out, and there's a lot that could be, a lot still needs to be looked at to see, is this a way moving forward that, should you be treating, maybe certain portions of the population that are at much higher risk, are those the ones that would be best, to be treated for H. pylori, because down the line we know they're at higher risk. It seems like maybe a mass administration of antibiotics wouldn't really be the best approach moving forward. But again, this is all up for debate, and I think that, again, it's not very old science. It was only more recently that we really came to understand this connection between the infection of a specific bacteria with ulcers and with gastric cancer. Okay. And so we talked before in the previous lecture about HPV, a specific virus that leads to the development of cervical cancer as well as other cancers, and then this bacterial infection that can put you at higher risk for gastric cancer. But this is not the whole story. And so the WHO estimates that about 2 million cancer cases per year, so about 18% of the entire global cancer burden, they're all attributable to chronic infections, making them the second most preventable cause of cancer. So it's not just HPV and it's not just H. pylori that are these infectious causes of cancer. There's other things out there that are that are going to cause the development of cancer. Okay. And what's interesting to note is that the significance of this, the prevalence of these infectious causes of cancer, are much larger in lower and middle class income countries than in high income countries. So we saw before with gastric cancer rates are going down in more Western populations, whereas they're still remaining higher in these lower and middle income countries. And so I think maybe as they industrialize, you could see this go down as a whole. Okay. Additionally, what puts you at higher risk of developing cancer is going to be increased in individuals that have chronic disease. So if you already have chronic disease present, something like HIV, AIDS, you're already immunocompromised, you're not as well equipped to handle infection and clear that infection, and so that again puts you at much higher risk of developing cancer. And so those that are healthy and those that are, then are faced with some sort of infection, they're much able to deal with that, clear it before it can cause something like cancer to develop. If you're already, suffering from maybe 1 or 2 chronic illnesses, then you are faced with some sort of infection that could potentially down the line lead to cancer, you're already at higher risk. So these are all sort of confounding factors which make it a little bit harder to treat this problem. And so there's right now recognized about 7 major infectious agents that have been identified as being carcinogenic to humans. So what we've covered before, and you can see here, is that the world cancer incidence, this is the Helicobacter pylori that we talked about, and this is going to be what's attributable to HPV. So it's a pretty large part of the pie here, what's attributed to worldwide cancer incidence that is caused by infectious agents. Another really large one that we didn't talk about in this class is hepatitis B and hepatitis C viruses. These are viruses that infect the liver, and down the line they can cause, inflammation in the liver, which can then lead to liver cancer. So it's a very large portion of the population. And then if you look at these other slices here, you have Epstein-Barr virus. This is associated with mononucleosis and is also associated with higher risk of very specific cancers. You also have other types of viruses on here, as well as you can see down here, these are actually specific parasitic infections that can put you at higher risk for developing cancer.